If you've ever used a HTML table, you must have used col span and row span attributes to merge cells across rows and columns. CSS Grid offers this and a few more powerful capabilities. Let's begin to explore them with this example of a contact form. If you look closely, it's a grid with 2 columns and 3 rows. The message input block spans across 2 rows and this button spans across 2 columns. This is what it looks like without grid. For small mobile screens, this would be perfect if we can simply add a gap between the input blocks. Here's the markup: a form, 3 input blocks, and a button. Scroll up, display, grid. We already know that this creates a grid with one single column and as many rows as the children. So for mobile screens, we just need to add a gap. Gap 1.5 rem. View in responsive mode. Yes, this looks great for mobile screens. Beyond a certain breakpoint, let's say about 540 pixels, let's add a media query. At media, screen, and min width 540 pixels, form. Now let's create 2 columns using grid template columns property. And we need 2 equal columns, so 1 FR, 1 FR. Let's see what we have now. We do have 2 columns, but nothing is in place. We want the message block to go up here, the email address to come down here, and the button to span across at the bottom. With grid, you can take any item and place it anywhere else in the entire grid. Powerful, right? Let's see how to do that. Let's inspect first. Click on grid. All this while we've been seeing these numbers 1, 2, 3. What are these numbers for? These are called grid lines. The column lines are numbered starting from 1, 1, 2, and 3. The row lines are also numbered starting from the top, starting from 1, 1, 2, and 3. For 2 columns, we have 3 column lines, and similarly for 2 rows, we have 3 row lines. Now to take this message block from its initial position and place it here, we need to reference the required column lines and row lines. So we want the message block to start from column line 2 and row line 1. Select the message block, ID message block. The CSS property used to specify the column line to start with is grid column start. The value would be the column line number. In this case, it's 2. Let's see what we have now. Yes, the message block is on the right, but it's not at the top, so it's not starting from row line 1. To do that, let's use the property grid row start, and the value here would be 1. We have the message block in place now, but it's not yet spanning across 2 rows, which is why the email block is down here. It does appear like there's a lot of empty space here, but no. If you inspect, this is still row number 1 and email address will not come into row number 1, right? But if we make the message block span across the first 2 rows, the problem is solved. We can do that using the grid row end property. Grid row end, we have 2 options. We can use the keyword span and specify how many rows we want this item to span. In our case, it's 2. So it starts from row line 1 and spans across 2 rows and then ends. Does this work? Yes, it does. This is exactly what we need. Notice that we didn't have to shift the email block up. It just occupies the empty cells available. We have another way of specifying the value for grid row end. If we know the exact line number the item ends at, we can directly use it. Like in our case, it's row line 3. And now let's see. Yes, it does give us the same output. Using the same concept, can you now try and make this button span across 2 columns? Let's do it. Select the button again within media queries, and using the grid column end property, use the span keyword and specify that it needs to span across 2 columns. Here, we don't need to specify the grid column start property because by default, it's anyway starting where we want it to start. Let's see. Great, this works. But what if we specify the line number as the grid column end value? Let's see what happens. Now it doesn't span across 2 columns because it just makes sure that it ends at column line 3, which is why if you're using grid column end, you also need to specify grid column start as 1. Then it works. If you want to use only one property, grid column end, then you will have to use the span keyword. There's one other way to specify our end column value. The last line number 3, let me inspect and show you. The column line 3 can also be referenced as column line -1. So the column lines can also be counted from the right as -1, -2 and -3. So we can change the grid column end to -1 also. This works as well. We wouldn't use negative values usually. You can use them mostly when you have 4 or 5 columns and when you want one of the items to end at the last line. Then the value -1 is convenient to specify last line. Now we just saw how to move around items in the grid and make them span across rows and columns using 4 different properties: grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, and grid row end. But these properties are quite verbose, so we do have some shorthand properties which are more commonly used than these. These 2 rules, grid row start and grid row end, can be combined into a single rule using the grid row property. The first value here is the start value, followed by a slash, and then the end value like this. Let's check. Yes, we still have the same output. Here, we can even use the span value that we previously used, span 2. This also works. Whichever is convenient, you can use that. So let me retain it as 1/3. Similarly, you can combine these 2 rules as well using a shorthand property, grid column, and here the first value is 1 slash -1, or you can say span 2, and since we don't have to specify 1 here, you can even remove it altogether and just say grid column span 2. This also works. And same is the case with grid column start here. You can simply say grid column 2, and then we don't have to specify the end value, so you can leave it as it is. Let me remove these comments. You can clearly see how this is much neater and readable as well. And everything still works the same. This can further be replaced by the grid area property. I find it a little confusing and I personally don't use it, but it's good to be aware of the syntax. Let me comment this out. Grid area. The first value here is the row start value 1. The second value is not the grid row end, instead it's the grid column start value, which is 2. The third value is the grid row end value 3. And the last one is the grid column end value. In our case, we can either say -1 or we can leave it blank also. Let's check. Yeah, it is still the same. Like I said, quite confusing. So I'll remove this and I'll retain what we had before. With a little practice, you'll love using these properties, grid column and grid row.